Funny how a seat at the table doesn't guarantee you a voice. I was balancing a tray of champagne flutes when Zoe handed me the graduation invitation. The cardstock was thick, embossed in gold, exactly the kind of overdone touch Vivian loved. Uncle Ethan, Zoe said gently, Mason wanted you to have this. No note. Not even a scrawl from my mother. Just a mass-printed card with Mason's smug grin staring back. I slipped the invitation into my jacket without a word. The kitchen was bustling with caterers in black aprons and hired florists, threading tulips through crystal vases. My house smelled like truffle oil and sugar glaze. Vivian had spared no expense to make sure Mason's graduation party screamed success. Meanwhile, I was slicing lemons. You're holding the tray wrong, Vivian snapped as she breezed by in her pearls and pale lavender. You'll smudge the glass. I set the tray down and looked at her. She didn't notice, or didn't care. She was already barking instructions at a florist about rearranging the centerpiece. I thought I'd help with the guest list, I said. Maybe stand by the entrance. Vivian blinked at me like I'd offered to juggle flaming knives. Don't be ridiculous. You'll just make people uncomfortable with your mood. I could feel the burn rising in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I'd been conditioned really not to snap back. That was Mason's job. He was allowed to be loud. I was expected to be quiet. Mason strolled in just then, phone in hand, laughing into his Bluetooth earpiece. MBA baby, he called to no one in particular. Wharton gave me the nod. Vivian clapped, like she'd witnessed the second coming. That's amazing, I said, stepping forward. He didn't hear me or pretended not to. Instead, he turned to a group of friends trailing behind him. The thing about success is knowing when to pivot. Unlike Ethan, who's still pivoting 5 years into his hobby company, I exhaled slowly, then walked out to the backyard. The sun was high over the manicured lawn. White tents flapped gently in the breeze. I stared out at the scene and tried to count how many guests would actually know who paid for this house. The granite countertops, the infinity pool, the dumbwaiter nobody used. None of them would know, because no one ever asked. Colin's voice broke my thoughts. He was wearing some awful coral blazer and that ever-present smirk. Ethan, he said, arms spread wide like we were old pals. Still the most available man in the Walker family, huh? What do you do with all your free time? Count your typos, I said flatly. He didn't laugh. Zoe appeared again, awkward, hovering. You okay? I nodded. She didn't believe me, but she didn't press. I headed back inside, thinking maybe I could sneak upstairs for a moment, regroup. But as I passed through the kitchen, Mason's voice rang out again. Hey, you guys ever hear of Walker Rebuilt? He asked his buddies. Real company. Real founder. I paused. He held up a mock microphone. Walker rebuilt what your ego laughter exploded behind me. I didn't turn, didn't speak. My fingers curled tight at my sides. I stepped onto the patio away from the noise. The clink of glasses, the murmurs of admiration for Mason's bright future, the soft cooing of Vivian's voice guiding donors and neighbors toward the dessert table, it all melted behind me. I took a breath, let it out, and then I reached into my pocket. The phone screen lit up instantly under my thumb. A few taps of Face ID blink, and there it was, clear as daylight. The Highland Park property. 4-bedroom, 3-bath colonial with a wine cellar and sunroom. Still under my name. Every empire has a funding source. Ours just prefers to stay anonymous. Monday morning. The sunlight barely filtered through the gray-tinted windows of the Walker Rebuilt executive office. I liked it that way. Filtered clean, detached. Janice's voice came through my laptop, sharp and efficient as always. 3 HVAC invoices for Highland Park are overdue. They've been marked urgent. Again I asked, without lifting my eyes from the financial dashboard. She nodded on the screen. Yes. And so are the pool maintenance, the landscaping, and 2 linen services. All billed under the scholarship fund. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. The scholarship fund, technically a family-run trust, was meant for promising business students, but the Walkers had been siphoning from it like it was their private ATM. Vivian had listed a floral designer under student development. Mason's car lease showed up as a transport stipend. Even Colin, who didn't belong to this bloodline by DNA or decency, had slipped in an invoice for executive support, a $1 $200 wine subscription. Janice waited patiently as I scrolled through the abuse. How long have they been doing this? About 14 months. Possibly longer. You only requested full transparency 2 weeks ago. That was after the party. After the laughter. After Mason's voice echoed through my skull like a knife through glass. I tapped on a column labeled Cost Centers. My name, Ethan Walker, sat quietly at the top beside a small lock icon. Just to confirm, I said calmly, I can pause disbursements at will. No advance notice required. Janice didn't blink. You hold 100% executive control over the trust. They don't know because they never asked. I highlighted the largest 10 expenses from the past year and added a flag: audit required. Start combing, I instructed. Cross-check every vendor, every contractor. I want proof of service, or they're out. Understood. At that moment, a shadow flickered across the glass outside my office. Zoe, in a navy hoodie and jeans, passed through the hallway. She caught a glimpse of my screen, a live dashboard of spending allocations, real-time red alerts flashing like quiet sirens. Her face remained neutral, unreadable. She didn't knock, just moved on. I returned to my inbox. Subject: event budget request, June reception from Colin D. Langston Body. Vivian suggests a 3-tiered setup with catering from Montclair. Estimated $11K. Please approve ASAP. Vendors need confirmation. Colin's timing was impeccable. Entitlement masked as urgency. I clicked forward, typed Janice's address, and attached a note. Flag this. I want a total freeze on new requests. Then I opened the control settings. A quiet row of toggles governed the entire Walker ecosystem: trust disbursements. Home equity draws, tuition fees, business transfers. I toggled them all off, one by one. A final message slid into the thread, effective immediately. No one spends a cent without me. I leaned back. For a moment, the room fell utterly silent. No gloating, no music, no voices. Just the hum of consequence settling into place. Across the hallway, Zoe had stopped. I hadn't seen her reappear, but there she was, leaning slightly against the corner. Her gaze tilted just enough to catch the reflection of my screen from the frosted wall glass. Budget numbers, frozen lines, red flags. She said nothing, not even a breath. Then she turned and walked away. Chicago Booth's graduation ceremony pulsed with ceremony and ego. Banners floated lazily in the May breeze, and rows of folding chairs lined the great lawn like a hierarchy spelled out in metal and plastic. The front seats gleamed under reserved placards: Walker V, Langston C, Walker M, Mine Row, K. Seat 38. Neatly printed, politely distant. I arrived 10 minutes early and alone. A dark suit, no-tie aviators hiding my reaction. My name wasn't on the family banner strung across the third-row tent. But that was fine. Names don't always mean ownership. From a distance, I spotted Vivian, radiant in emerald, holding court like she always had. Her voice carried just enough for me to hear her say, "This is Colin Mason's strategic advisor and closest support." Colin shook hands, grinning like a junior senator. Mason, in his black gown, looked every bit the golden boy. He played to the crowd, arms slung over friends' shoulders, taking selfies in angles he'd probably memorized. Not once did his eyes scan the back rows. Not once did they land on me. I took my seat. The ceremony began with all the pomp: expected marching music, slow faculty procession, thunderous applause for names barely pronounced right. When Mason took the stage to give the graduate address, the applause was louder than the microphone feedback. He adjusted the podium, looked out over the sea of expectant faces, and said, "To my mother Vivian, who raised me with grace, grit, and the best taste in mid-century furniture, I owe more than I can say." The crowd laughed warmly. I also want to thank Colin, who pushed me, challenged me, and made me think like a CEO even before I had a title. My name never made it into the speech, not even a stray syllable. Then came the moment I'd expected. Colin leaned in, smirking as he whispered to the woman seated next to him, loud enough to carry. "We're the next chapter of the Walker legacy," he chuckled. "Ethan. He's more like the epilogue." Laughter followed. A few heads turned toward me in the back row just to see if I'd heard. I kept my gaze forward. Across the aisle, Zoe hesitated in her seat. I saw it just for a second, the twitch in her hand, the impulse to stand and walk over. But then her eyes found Vivian's. Something unspoken passed between them, and Zoe sat still. Her loyalty wasn't mine to count on. Not yet. The MC returned to the stage. "Please turn your attention to the screen for a tribute video celebrating the Walker family's contributions." The lights dimmed. A montage began. Mason as a toddler splashing in a pool, Vivian cutting a ribbon at a library, a vacation photo in Tuscany. Music swelled behind them. One slide stopped the room cold. It was a family photo, recent. Mason, Vivian, Zoe, even Colin awkwardly tucked into the edge. I remembered that photo. I took it. But in this version, I was cropped out, seamlessly erased, as if I had never stood behind the lens or under the sun that day. The audience applauded. Vivian dabbed a tear. I sat in silence, expression fixed, pulse quiet. There it was, the final revision. History rewritten in real time. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and typed a single message to Janice. "Let's begin the extraction." I pressed send, then smiled just enough for it to sting. Janice's voice came through my Bluetooth speaker, clipped and efficient. "Vivian's Amex just got declined at Clarendon Spa. She asked the receptionist if the machine was broken." I didn't respond immediately. I was watching the transaction dashboard, a subtle dip forming like the start of a controlled demolition. Janice continued. "Also, the auxiliary card tied to Mason's dining account bounced at Aurelia's. $418.50, including wine and valet." "Keep everything offline," I said. "No alerts. No statements." "Understood." I hung up and leaned back. A week ago, I began pulling strings quietly. First, we revoked the supplementary credit lines attached to Walker-funded trusts. No announcements, just silent deactivation. Vivian's platinum card was now ornamental. Mason's monthly expense retainer had expired without renewal. Colin's corporate account canceled. I didn't need noise. I wanted discomfort that felt confusing. Random. Bank error. App glitch. Surely nothing intentional. By midweek, Vivian had gone from annoyed to irate. At Le Jardin, her card was declined again. Her laughter was forced when she handed the waiter a second card. Mason, seated beside her, looked visibly embarrassed, though he muttered something about those useless banking apps. Colin, of course, responded like a middle manager under fire. Subject urgent, budget override, from Colin Langston to Ethan Walker. "Hi, Ethan. We're facing some unexpected hiccups in the disbursement cycle. Can we approve a temporary reserve budget to avoid disruption for Vivian and Mason's engagements this week? Attached is a line item breakdown. Thanks, CL. I left the email unread. The data told me everything I needed." Janice shared daily usage heat maps, each day lighter red. By Thursday, the Walker cash flow curve had dropped 64%. They weren't suffering, not yet. But they were squirming. And squirming breeds mistakes. That night, I returned home late, poured myself a glass of Oban, and scrolled through the old family drive on my laptop. Buried between summer vacation folders and charity gala PDFs was a JPEG titled Walker Holiday 2016. I opened it. There we were, me, Mason, Vivian. My father long passed. Zoe embraces, everyone smiling through cold December light. The photo had been staged in front of the fireplace. Vivian had insisted on burgundy and gray outfits for visual harmony. It was the last time I remembered feeling like a son in that house. I walked over to the gallery wall in the hallway. The framed print of that same photo hung above the console table. I took it down gently, like dislodging a relic. Outside, the wind was picking up. I stepped onto the patio, struck a match, and held the edge of the photo above the flame. The faces distorted first, then dissolved. I let the ashes drift into the air. By Friday, Colin cracked. He called. Not emailed, not texted. Called. I let it ring twice, then answered. Are you cutting us off? His voice was tight, angry but unsure. What the hell are you doing, Ethan? I said nothing. He exhaled, waiting. Then added, Vivian is furious. Mason's blaming me. If you're trying to prove a point, congratulations, it's loud and clear. I could hear background noise, maybe Mason shouting. Ethan, I hung up. A few hours later, I found Zoe standing just outside my office at Walker Rebuilt, pretending to study the abstract painting I'd bought last fall. She didn't say anything, just glanced toward my desk, toward the screen still glowing with budget freezes revoked cards, and a note from Janice that read simply, Silence is holding. Zoe met my eyes, and for the first time she looked like she was trying to understand, not escape. I didn't flinch. Let them scramble. This was just phase 1. It was nearly 9:30 p.m. The Walker Rebuilt building had emptied out, save for the faint hum of cleaning crews and the occasional elevator chime. I had stayed behind to finish a project mock-up, partly for work, mostly to avoid going home. The silence was almost comforting, like walking through a glass museum after hours. I stepped into the elevator from the executive floor. As the doors began to close, I noticed something on the brushed metal floor. A small black USB drive barely visible in the dim lighting with a worn label on its side. WR. Internal only. The handwriting was clean, familiar. Ethan's. I bent down and picked it up, hesitating. I should have turned it in. That's what a good assistant or a cautious sister would do. Instead, I slipped it into my coat pocket. Back in my apartment, I paced for 20 minutes before I finally plugged the drive into my laptop. It clicked in with a soft beep, like the beginning of something I couldn't undo. 4 folders, all dated within the last 2 months. One labeled Transfers. See Reese, I opened it. The files were dense but revealing. Dozens of PDFs, wire transfers, offshore holdings, masked account names, and a string of consistent recipients. One in particular kept showing up. See Reese. And then it hit me. Colin Reese. My stomach tightened. The amounts were staggering. $180,000 routed through shell accounts. $65,000 in consulting invoices billed to a Walker Rebuilt dummy subsidiary in Delaware. Each file showed the source of funds, the company. Ethan's company. I printed one of the reports. Just one. Then, I unplugged the USB, wiped the connection log, and locked the printout in the bottom drawer of my closet beneath a stack of old university binders. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, Colin caught me by the coffee machine. His tone was overly casual, like he was testing the water before he dove into something deeper. Hey, you've seen Ethan lately? I sipped my coffee slowly. Yesterday. Why? He shrugged, eyes darting. Just wondering. He's been off, don't you think? Pulled funding for a bunch of our joint accounts? Not even a heads up. I tilted my head. Maybe you should ask him. He narrowed his eyes but smiled. You'd tell me if something was weird, right? I didn't answer. Just raised an eyebrow and walked away. Later that afternoon, I forwarded myself the report from Ethan's assistant, Janice. She'd mistakenly CC'd me on a budget reconciliation weeks ago, and I kept the email buried in my archive. This time, her message was directed solely to Ethan. Subject: irregular transfers. From Janice Miller to Ethan Walker. Colin Reese. linked to multiple payments routed through SPG Holdings. Shell entity unregistered staff matching funds to WR grants. Flagged for immediate review. I closed the email. Then I reopened the USB files on a secure viewer and noticed something new, something I'd missed. The final entry in the last spreadsheet had a note in red: Walker rebuilt funds misused under Mason's name. Operator, Colin Reese. I sat back stunned. They'd been using Mason's name, maybe even his access codes, all while funneling Ethan's money through fake vendors and offshore ghosts. And Ethan, he must have known. That's why the funding cuts. That's why the silence. I reached for my phone. Hands trembling slightly, I snapped 3 pictures of the screen just in case and started typing. Ethan, we need to talk. I didn't send it immediately. I stared at the message for a full minute before pressing send. No turning back now. You're not the villain, Ethan, but you're no hero either. She said it without raising her voice, just let the words settle between us, heavier than the steam curling from her cup of black coffee. We sat across from each other in a half-empty cafe on Riverside. Same crooked ceiling fan, same peeling walls. It hadn't changed since Zoe was 16. I remembered bringing her here when she failed her math final, how she'd hidden behind a giant hot chocolate and told me, I guess I'm not a genius after all. I'd said neither am I. But I play one convincingly. Tonight she wasn't hiding behind anything. She reached into her coat and slid the USB across the table. I saw enough to know Colin's been skimming. I didn't want to believe it at first, but I nodded. You were supposed to find it. Zoe blinked. What? I dropped it intentionally. I needed to know if you'd open it or turn it in. That was a test, no. It was an invitation. She exhaled sharply, eyes narrowing. God, Ethan, that's manipulative even for you. I didn't argue. Instead, I sipped my coffee and looked out the window toward the river. The night shimmered in silence. Behind the glass, our reflections stared back, an uncle and a niece caught between blood and betrayal. I always thought you'd be the one who noticed, I said. You never bought the fairy tale, even when you were young. Zoe leaned forward. Then why didn't you say anything back then? Why not speak up 10 years ago when they started freezing you out? I met her gaze. I tried. But in this family, justice is a costume. They wear it for donors, for the press, for dinners with the mayor. Behind closed doors, they operate on a different currency: loyalty, power, silence. She sat back, arms folded. And you chose silence too. I chose survival. Her jaw tightened. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't entirely right either. She pulled out her phone. Vivian emailed me this afternoon. Said you've been acting erratic. She wants me to observe and report. See if you're losing grip. I laughed, one of those dry, brittle laughs that come from a place too tired to care. Classic Vivian. Undermine the man before he speaks. Zoe tapped her fingers on the table, then looked up at me. I want in. But not as your assistant. Not as your spy. If I'm doing this, I get access. Full access. Documents, accounts, strategies. No filters. I considered her for a long second. You know what that means, I do. You'll see how far this rot goes. Already started. A pause. Then I reached into my jacket and slid a small matte black keycard across the table. It shimmered slightly under the amber cafe light. Code is 1976, I said. Server room West Wing. You'll need the retinal scan, but the override's in place. She looked down at it, then back at me. Is this the part where I say, thank you? No. This is the part where you decide whether you're ready to go to war. Zoe took the card, slipped it into her pocket, and nodded. The dead can't answer, but their signatures still speak. Janice said it as she handed me the folder, her voice flat, but her eyes razor sharp. She didn't need to explain what I was looking at. The name was there in bold, dated clearly: George Walker, March 14, 2019. I stared at the signature for a long time. He died in March, I said slowly. Janice blinked. Yes. March 2018. We let the silence sit there, a deep, ugly kind. The kind that comes when the room shifts and something in your gut starts screaming before your brain can catch up. Zoe stepped closer, scanning the contract. Share transfer authorization. 70% equity shift to Mason retroactive to January 1st. I didn't move. My father's signature was inked neatly, flowing the way I remembered from birthday cards and tax forms. A perfect imitation because it was real. Too real. You're sure this wasn't missed in probate? I asked Janice. I handle all records personally. This wasn't in the 2018 disclosures. Someone planted it. Zoe knelt, already pulling out her laptop. Let's verify through public records. If this was ever notarized, there'll be a trace. I looked at her. You want to go now? She closed the laptop. I already booked us a slot. Cook County Clerk's office. Saturday window. Janice smirked. Taught her well. 2 hours later, we were standing inside a musty archive room at the old courthouse. The clerk barely glanced up from his sandwich as Zoe handed over the request slip. Walker, George. 2019 filing, she said, crisp and calm. He disappeared into the back. I counted the seconds by watching the flicker of the fluorescent lights above. 35. 38. 41. He came back with a file. Zoe opened it on the desk. Inside 2 documents, one a notarized scan, the other a blue ink original. Same page, same lines, same neat looping George W. Walker. Zoe's hand stilled. That's his signature, I murmured. Yes, she said, voice tight. But you and I both know this paper came from a ghost. Then we heard her voice behind us. I should have known you'd dig this far. Vivian. She walked in like she owned the building. Burgundy heels clicking over the marble black gloves still on despite the warm air. You have no right going through these. She snapped eyes on Zoe. These aren't your records. Zoe stood her ground. They're public. Vivian turned to me. George knew Mason was the only one who could protect the company. He gave him authority long before the board formalized it. I took a slow step forward. That's hard to confirm, since he was already buried when he signed this. Her eyes narrowed into slits. You're accusing your own family of forgery. No, I said softly. I'm accusing someone. And if it turns out to be family, well, so be it. Zoe slid her phone out, silently snapped a high-resolution image of the original, and slid it back into her coat. Vivian stormed out. When the door clicked shut, Zoe looked at me, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't just about money anymore. I nodded. She was right. Now it was about truth. And the dead were speaking louder than the living ever had. He's the golden boy. Until he isn't. From the polished marble of his high-rise penthouse, Mason Walker looked like a man who had it all, until I watched him stumble onto the balcony and hurl a glass against the concrete rail. It was the 3rd time in 10 minutes he'd stepped out mid-call. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd arrived early under the pretext of confirming event logistics, but the truth was simpler. I didn't trust Mason. The phone was still pressed to his ear, his back to me. I edged just close enough to hear muffled fragments. What do you mean pending approval? That was wired 2 weeks ago. No, I don't give a damn about regulatory delay. If that check bounces, we're finished. The call ended with another muttered curse. He stood there a moment longer, shoulders tight, then stormed back in eyes scanning the room like he suspected he'd been overheard. I stepped out of view, ducking behind the corner of the hallway just in time. When he passed by, he didn't see me, but I saw everything. The tremor in his left hand, the scratch on his neck from stress picking, the twitch of someone holding back panic. Colin was already waiting in the lounge, sipping something that looked too brown to be tea. You need to calm down, Colin said, looking up as Mason approached. You're bleeding heat. The team's starting to notice. There's no team if the money doesn't land, Mason snapped. Which money? Colin asked too casually. Mason paused. A beat too long. That hesitation that was all I needed. From my hidden angle behind the stairwell column, I captured a silent burst of photos. Mason's pale face, Colin's narrowed eyes, and behind it all the nervous scaffolding holding up a family empire. Vivian arrived shortly after. She moved like a stage manager backstage during opening night, adjusting Mason's collar, swiping at invisible lint, kissing his cheek with the warmth of a marble statue. "You need to keep it together," she murmured too low for anyone but Mason to hear. "You're the face. Not your brother. Not me. You." "I'm trying," he muttered. "Try harder," she replied. As they exited toward the conference hall, I sent a single text to a number I'd memorized. "He's cracking. Push now." No name. No reply needed. The fundraising event was glossy as always, chandeliers, string quartet, hand-passed hors d'oeuvres. But Mason looked wrong in it, like a man wearing armor that no longer fit. He smiled for the cameras, shook hands, gave a speech he'd clearly rehearsed until a sponsor pulled him aside. I didn't catch the full exchange, just the flash of their business card. The banker's tight smile, the brief nod toward the accounting table. Minutes later, I saw Mason stagger back from the conversation like he'd been slapped. Colin met him near the elevator. They pulled the pledge. Mason hissed. "Which one, Cedarline Trust? 2 million. They flagged the ledger. "Inconsistencies?" Colin blinked. Mason grabbed his arm. "You said the numbers were clean. Fix it, or I swear you'll go down first." Colin didn't respond, but the look in his eyes wasn't shock, it was calculation. He'd just been given motive. When dogs are cornered, they bite. When Colin is cornered, he hacks. It started with a single alert from Janice. Unauthorized access detected. Financial ledger C3. Then another. And another. Before I even finished reading the string of flags, she called, "Ethan, we're bleeding out." I bolted upright in my chair. How much estimated? 60 grand. Real-time transfers. Someone's rerouting through Tier 2 redundancies. I'm pulling plugs, but we're behind. My stomach dropped. I rushed toward the server room, my keycard shaking in my hand as the doors beeped open. The room was humming cool and lifeless, but inside the system someone was carving arteries. Janice's voice came through the comm. "It's coming from an internal proxy. Who I can't pinpoint yet. Whoever it is, they knew the fallback routes. This wasn't brute force. This was premeditated." I didn't say what I already suspected. Zoe was already at her station when I reached, her floor fingers flying over the keyboard monitors, reflecting lines of code and blinking IP logs. "I'm trying to isolate the origin," she said without looking at me. "But they're masking through a proxy chain and using legacy access tunnels from the internal audit node." That narrowed it to one person. "Colin," I muttered. Zoe paused. She didn't ask how I knew. She knew too. "Should we lock the system?" she asked. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. I initiated a full lockdown, every sub-account, every delegated credential, every authorized user frozen until further notice, including hers. A few seconds later, her screen dimmed. What the hell, she snapped. I just lost access. I shut everything down. Including me. I met her eyes. "You think I'm in on this?" "I think I said carefully that when someone's drowning, they'll grab whoever's close, whether you're pulling them out or not." She stared at me for a long beat, then turned her screen away and began rebooting from a clean slate. Meanwhile, my personal account pinged. Incoming mail. Re-system breach. There was no address, no name, just a single line. "Try to shut me out again and you'll lose more than just money." My throat tightened. I knew that tone. It was Colin's beneath the cowardice of anonymity. I forwarded the message to Janice with a 2-word subject: "Encrypt everything." Downstairs, Zoe was pulling logs. She didn't speak, didn't look up, but I felt the weight of her silence. When I returned an hour later, she stood facing her wall of monitors. Frozen. "What is it?" She pointed to the screen. There's a ghost access pattern. Someone installed a piggyback script on a maintenance subnet, from where she hesitated, then clicked on the origin node. It was her machine. Someone used my workstation to backdoor into the proxy. I said nothing. Neither did she. We didn't need to. This wasn't just Colin retaliating. He was implicating Zoe. The war had shifted fronts no longer about numbers or names, but trust. And in this building, trust was currency no one could afford. Some fires burn property. Others burn credibility. The room was flawless at first. Golden uplighting framed the banners of our rebranded name, Walker Rebuilt. Fresh navy blue logos stitched into linen. Glasses clinked, shoes clicked. Investors nodded with cautious curiosity. For once, the air didn't feel heavy with the family's shadow. Zoe adjusted my tie on stage just before I walked out. Remember, she said, don't attack the family. Rise above it. I gave a slight nod. She stayed near the AV board, her laptop linked to the projector, ready to cue the launch video after my speech. Janice stood in the wings, poised with the financial decks. Mason, cold as marble, stood next to Vivian near the back. Neither had touched the canapes. I stepped into the spotlight. Good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight, for believing that transparency still matters. A few camera flashes blinked. A couple of phones streamed live. I continued, voice even. We built this house from steel and cement. But over time, it was weighed down by legacy, by backroom decisions, blurred lines, and unspoken debts. Walker Rebuilt will be different, independent, auditable, clean. The applause began softly, then swelled. I clicked to cue the brand video behind me. Instead of our logo, black code lines scrawled across the screen. Gasps, then silence. Text began appearing in bright red, leaked internal transactions. Walker Holdings 2018 names, $signs, ledger files, a data dump of buried secrets. Zoe rushed to the control board, eyes wide. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, trying to override. Too late. Another message blinked up. This is not a rebranding. It's a cover-up. A truth seeker within. The crowd rippled with murmurs. Cameras flipped from portrait to landscape. Mason turned on his heel, storming out without a word. Vivian followed seconds later, her heels stabbing the floor like nails into a coffin. Flashes followed them. My throat dried. I stepped down from the podium. Janice hissed from the side. We're hemorrhaging coverage. Twitter's live. Press already framing this as a failed whistleblower cover-up. I turned to Zoe. Shut it down. I'm trying, she said, teeth clenched. The malware tunneled through the presentation layer. I can't access the core without weight. Her fingers froze. What I asked. She didn't answer at first, just stared at the root folder. Then quietly, almost inaudibly. This framework, it's mine. I blinked. You what? I wrote this code years ago. It was a sandbox protocol I developed while interning at Mason's tech lab. He had access to it. Her face flushed with panic. I didn't know he kept it, let alone weaponized it. I didn't speak. She reached for my arm. Ethan, listen. I didn't. I pulled back. You handed him the knife. I said, my voice like steel. Whether you meant to or not. The lights dimmed around us. The crowd dispersed like smoke. All that was left was broken trust and the heat of a fire we couldn't contain. When trust breaks, the smartest thing to do is pretend it never did. I stepped into Mason's office like a schoolgirl asking for forgiveness. Hair tied back, hands clasped, eyes unsure but not too unsure. Can we talk? I asked. Mason leaned against his desk, arms folded like he'd been waiting for this moment since the night of the launch disaster. You've got nerve walking in here, he said. I know, I whispered. But I need to fix things. I panicked. I didn't know the code would be used that way. I want a chance to make it right. He didn't soften, not really. But his pride did the heavy lifting. You always wanted to play with the big boys, Zoe, but you were too naive to realize you'd get eaten. I lowered my eyes. I'm not here to argue. Mason moved closer, savoring every word. You think Ethan's any better? He built that rebrand fantasy on a pile of paperwork he barely understood. The second things got messy, he blamed you. Typical. Just like George did with my mother. I stayed quiet, let the silence thicken. Then I nodded slowly. I want back in. Wherever you need me. He smiled, something thin and reptilian. All right, you'll start by cleaning up the server logs. There's a lot of noise from the launch. We need to scrub and reset. I forced a shaky smile. Of course. He turned his back to me. That was when I pressed record on my phone. Outside, I ducked into an alleyway and called Janice. Got it, I said. He gave me everything: Ethan slander, system tampering, even a nod to George. Janice whistled. Send me the file, I'll prep it for insurance. If we time this right, it'll blow a hole straight through his image. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt it. Not guilt, not fear. Control. Colin's bar of choice was dim wood-paneled and smelled of whiskey and secrets. I spotted him in a booth with his sleeves rolled up and a bourbon already half empty. You're brave, he muttered when I sat down. Or stupid. Maybe both. I ordered soda water and watched him swirl the ice in his glass. You're not here for pleasantries, he said. So let's skip the dance. Fine. I leaned in. You helped breach Ethan's system. But the method. How the hell did Mason get that script? He didn't flinch. It wasn't me, he said, then downed his drink. It was Vivian. I blinked. That's not possible. She doesn't even understand half of... She didn't have to. She has people. And leverage. And a deeper motive than any of us. Mason's the golden boy. I'm the fixer. But Vivian. She's the general. I exhaled. You just gave me exactly what I needed. Colin smiled grimly. I didn't give it. You stole it. But fair's fair, you earned it. He stood swaying a bit. You're smarter than you look, Zoe. But smart girls don't always live long in this game. On my way out, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, nice move. Now be careful. The next piece costs blood. I stared at the message, my heart skipping once, then steadying. They knew I was playing bait. What they didn't know was, I'd already moved on to setting the trap. Dead men don't own trusts. Unless someone makes them. It started with a bank statement. Just a routine folder Janice passed along one morning, but something about the name hit Ethan like a gut punch. George Walker Trust. Dad dissolved all his accounts before he passed. Ethan said slowly, eyes scanning the document. He wanted everything clean. But the trust was still moving, money, substantial amounts transferred overseas in regular intervals from 2019 through late 2023. Hidden accounts, Janice said. Discreet low-flag jurisdictions. Whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing. We drove across town to the Central Archive vault of First Union. The banker looked at us as if we were digging through ghosts. Maybe we were. The files on George Walker Trust were thin, too thin for something that had handled millions. The originating documents were there, but none of the closure orders. No dissolution. Just continuous fund activity. I thought George cleaned this all out, Ethan muttered. He told me he would, I said. After the audit fiasco in 2017, he wanted a clean legacy. Janice pulled up the original probate filings on her tablet. No mention of the trust in the will, she confirmed. No listed assets. No tax disclosures. That wasn't an oversight. It was an erasure. Mr. Halverson's office smelled like old oak and dying books. He was almost as old as the walls around him, his voice dusty but firm. I handled George's affairs for 20 years, he said. Smart man, thorough. He told me he planned to dissolve all trusts to avoid any posthumous mess. So why wasn't it done? Ethan asked. The lawyer sighed. I never received the final directive. I drafted the documents, but they were never signed. I assumed. He changed his mind. Ethan leaned forward. Did you ever see him after drafting the papers? No, Halverson said. He sent a note through his assistant. I trusted it. The word landed heavy between us. Trust. What a dangerous thing. That night, Ethan spread the papers across the desk in his apartment. Each bank record lined up like puzzle pieces, each payment, each transfer leading to something darker. This isn't just fraud, he said finally. It's identity theft. From the grave. I didn't speak. I just opened the envelope I'd picked up from the bank archives earlier. Inside were signature cards, verification records. I handed one to him. This is supposed to be George's signature. He looked down. Froze. That's not Dad's writing, he said. I placed another card beside it. This one from a document Mason had signed last year, buried in a vendor agreement. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same curl on the W, same jagged pressure on the R. Ethan's jaw tightened. Mason forged Dad's name. I shook my head. No. He learned it. Perfected it. He stared at the signatures, then at the account still alive under a dead man's name. Vivian wouldn't have touched the paperwork herself. She would have needed someone obedient. I nodded and trained. We sat in silence. One name, 2 decades of control, and a mountain of stolen identity masquerading as legacy. Empires rot from within, but this one decided to collapse in public. The clip surfaced at 7:32 a.m. By noon, it had 500,000 views. By 3 p.m., it was being dissected on national news. Mason Walker, in full arrogance, leaning forward in the boardroom voice, sharp. If these investors don't get in line, we'll find others who speak our language. And as for Zoe, she was a pretty face with a laptop. Now she's just another risk we've outgrown. The footage was grainy but damning. Worse, it was time-stamped just 2 weeks ago. Someone inside had leaked it and done so with surgical precision. Janice texted me one line, "He's bleeding out. Fast." By evening, WR's 2 largest investors had frozen their funding. Their public statements were clinical but cutting. We are reviewing our relationship with Walker Rebuilt pending internal governance audits. Mason tried to contain the fire by disappearing from public view, but the inferno only spread. The barbed comments about me triggered a second wave, this time from former interns, ex-staffers, and even a few mid-level executives who had sat silently for too long. Walked over started trending. Vivian's silence lasted less than 24 hours. She summoned Mason home. Not to consult, to condemn. We only knew about it because Colin, before vanishing, left Janice a voice memo. "You should have seen her," his voice whispered. She slapped him, called him a disgrace, said if George were alive he'd have disowned him before breakfast. Colin hadn't been seen since that recording. Ethan suspected he was headed for a border, any border. "He'll try Canada first," Ethan said. "If not, he'll risk Mexico." I asked if we should stop him. "No," he replied. "Let the rat scurry. We'll deal with the Queen." Later that night, I received an email from a major investigative outlet, subject exclusive offer, interview with Zoe Rainsford. They wanted the scoop. I had it. But I said no. "Not yet," I wrote. "We're not finished." Mason resurfaced 2 days later. He called for a press conference. He looked tired, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit. "I take full responsibility for the language I used. I deeply regret the hurt caused. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position at Walker Rebuilt." The crowd applauded, but behind the scenes, Janice uncovered something darker. In the same week, Mason had filed to sell 34% of his shares in WR, his entire holding, to a Cayman-based investment group. The timing was poison, the intention treacherous. He wasn't stepping back. He was cashing out, transferring power, selling silence. I didn't speak to him. I just typed. From zrainsfordwrcorp.com to mwalkerolwrcorp.com. Subject share transaction. Article 8 violation. This transaction breaches Article 8 of WR's internal charter prohibiting equity transfer to unvetted foreign entities during active investigations. I have filed a temporary injunction with the board and legal counsel. See you in court. I hit send. Then I leaned back. It was no longer a family feud. It was a full-blown collapse. And the next blow would be public. They thought the courtroom would protect them. It didn't. The courtroom smelled like old wood and slow justice. Federal Court, downtown Chicago. A place meant for calm proceedings, quiet motions, and bored clerks. But not today. Today, it felt like war. Ethan sat beside our lead attorney, back straight, eyes locked on the defense table where Vivian Walker adjusted her pearl necklace like it might shield her from what was coming. Mason slouched next to her, jaw clenched, lips twitching. I sat behind them, waiting to be called. This wasn't a full trial yet. Just a hearing to determine if the charges held water. We brought a flood. Your Honor. Ethan's lawyer began rising with practiced gravitas. We present conclusive evidence that the entity known as the George Walker Trust continued to operate posthumously against the decedent's express verbal intent and, without valid legal authorization, he handed the judge a bound folder, Exhibits A through G, transfer slips, internal memos, transaction timelines. The judge raised an eyebrow at the amount, some single payments exceeding $500,000, all routed offshore. Then came Zoe's turn. I stood steady. My palms didn't sweat. Not anymore. We also present this forensic analysis, I said, placing a smaller folder on the bench. 3 different signatures, 2 verified as George Walker's, 1 from the disputed trust document, and that one I turned locking eyes with Mason. Matches. Mason Walker's handwriting, not George Walker's. Vivian sprang up like a wound clock. That's hearsay. My husband authorized me verbally. He told me to preserve the family assets. Mason only helped with logistics. Ethan's attorney didn't blink. With respect, verbal instructions do not legally authorize the operation or amendment of a federal trust, and logistics don't include forgery. The room shifted. The judge leaned back. The defense attorney whispered something frantically to Vivian, who ignored him. Mason, however, cracked. "You all think you're so clean?" he snapped, rising from his seat. "My father wouldn't have left you a damn thing if he'd seen what you were trying to turn his company into." He jabbed a finger toward Ethan. "You and your Purity Act, shoving us out, pretending you're better." The judge banged his gavel once. "Sit down, Mr. Walker." Mason didn't move, but Vivian yanked him down by the sleeve. The prosecution rested, and the judge asked if I had any final remarks as a witness. I stood again. This time, not for documents. For years, I said they've used George Walker's name like a signature stamp on papers he never saw for decisions he never made. I paused, letting that settle. They didn't just steal money. They stole a man's legacy and tried to bury the truth with it. Silence. Then the judge spoke. "This court finds sufficient cause to proceed to full trial. Effective immediately, all assets under dispute, including those linked to the George Walker Trust, are to be frozen under federal authority." He struck the gavel twice. Vivian went pale. Mason, for once, had nothing to say. And Ethan didn't smile. We weren't done. We were just finally playing on level ground. Truth isn't always justice, but sometimes it's enough. 10 years. That's how long it had been since Ethan last stepped inside his father's old storage loft, what George used to call the quiet place. It still smelled like cedar and gasoline. Dust lingered in the air like ghosts reluctant to leave. He walked over to the battered workbench where George once built his first prototype, the one that launched a company and a dynasty. His fingers trailed over the initials burned into the wood, GW. Then he lit a single candle. No ceremony, just silence. "I hated you for a long time," he said softly. Not with anger, just fact. I hated that you didn't fight harder, that you let her twist everything after you were gone. He exhaled. But I see it now. You weren't silent out of cowardice. You were tired. And maybe you trusted the wrong people. His hand rested on the envelope he carried. But I won't be tired, and I won't trust them. He laid the envelope on the bench and whispered, I'm done carrying your war. 2 days later, the media gathered at the newly renamed Walker Rebuilt headquarters. No champagne, no banners, just a simple podium and a black and white logo behind Ethan, Janice, and me. The press expected fireworks. What they got was closure. Ethan began. Walker Holdings is no more. Its shell has been dissolved. Its assets have been liquidated or redirected. He gestured toward Janice, who nodded. Every dollar has been audited, every hidden file exposed, and all active funds are now redirected into community investment initiatives, environmental restoration, and startup innovation. He paused. And yes, Ms. Zoe Winters has agreed to serve as interim executive officer during this transition. The room buzzed. Cameras flashed. But Ethan wasn't done. I want to be clear, he said, voice steady. This isn't a rebranding. It's an admission of guilt, of rot, of the fact that legacy without integrity is just ego. He looked at me, then back to the crowd. We're not just rebuilding a company, we're rebuilding a name, a truth, and maybe a future. After the conference, we returned to Ethan's office. It was nearly empty now. He handed me a small envelope. Don't open this yet, he said. But one day, when you're wondering if it was worth it, read it then. He paused, his expression softer than I'd ever seen. You're better than any of us ever hoped this family could produce. Then he left. He didn't say goodbye, just walked out with a satchel and a breath of peace that felt earned. Janice stayed behind to handle post-press logistics. I stayed behind too, just for a moment. Alone in the quiet office, I opened my laptop. A single new message sat in my inbox. No subject line. It was from Colin. Sent from Luxembourg. Tell Ethan. I never meant to become him. I sat back in my chair. The family had fractured. The empire had collapsed. The truth had been dragged, bloodied, and exposed into the light. But somewhere in all of it, something real had survived. And maybe for once that was enough. I stood in the ashes of what they tried to build on lies, and for once I didn't feel small. They had power, yes, but they mistook silence for weakness and forgot that even broken voices can roar when truth is on their side. Justice didn't come wrapped in court verdicts or public shame. It came in the quiet undoing of everything they thought untouchable. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime. If you felt this story strike a chord, leave a comment below. Type 1 if you felt seen, type 2 if it still left something unresolved. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that speak truth to power.